Now that we've done a bunch of vocabulary exercises, and we're going to still continue to do them, we're actually going to go through the process of reading a short story. So the overview for this lesson is, well, we're going to do the Hollywood 3-act, and then we're going to learn some literature jargon, and then I'm going to give you an introduction to Ray Bradbury and a short story called The Veldt. So first off, what's a Hollywood 3-act? If you've done the writing course, you already kind of know what this is, and we've already gone over it. So I'm going to give you a very quickly written story and a very quick summarization of a story where I tell, not show. And in this story, we'll illustrate what the Hollywood 3-act is. In the Old West, a bandit and his gang were spending their stolen money in an Old West saloon. The lead bandit says to his gang that he's bored and he wants to do something bigger. Another objects and says that it's better not to take any more risk. The lead bandit accuses him of being a coward. Then, a railroad worker comes in and orders drinks for his friends. The bandits hear the worker talk about the train track coming to town. The lead bandit knows that this means there's going to be a lot of money in the bank. The bandit pulls his band together and says, "Boys, it's time to rob the bank, unless you're all chicken." The bandit and his gang work together. At night, two of his gang distract the bank guards with gunfire, while the rest use dynamite, and they are on the road cackling their way to victory. The next day, the railroad workers went to get to their payroll at the camp, and the banker said it was all stolen. This made him and the other workers very angry. They tracked down and searched town after town until they finally found where the gang was hidden. The worker challenged the bandit to the duel. The bandit laughed at the worker and said, "If you're so ready to die, you can borrow one of my pistols." Then, in front of his gang, the bandit and the worker face off. The worker drops his pistol and called the bandit a coward unless he fought barehanded. The bandit looked at his wide-eyed men. Then he grunted and dropped his gun. The worker knocked out the bandit with one punch, and the rest of the gang ran away. The end. Everybody lived happily ever after. Real short, choppy story, but it's to illustrate a very important fact: the Hollywood 3-act. So, the Hollywood 3-act begins with, appropriately named, Act 1. Act 1 introduces a setting, and it introduces the lead characters and the conflict. It will end with something called the first turning point, or as I usually term it, the first doorway. So, who's our lead characters in this little short story that we've just run over? Well, we got the railroad worker and the bandit. Okay, they're kind of enemies for obvious reasons, as you see in Act 2 of why they're opposed together. And what's the conflict? Well, we got bandits in town and they're robbing people, and then they just robbed a bank, and now a bunch of railroad workers can't get money for their hard work. That's a big deal. Now, what's the first doorway here? Well, it began like a day like any other, a bunch of bandits spending money in the saloon, but then it changed when the lead bandit said, "Hey, we're going to go ahead and rob a bank." Act 2. This conflict, this problem intensifies. We see some characters develop, and it ends with the second doorway, or, kind of right before the climax is what it is. In this story, what did we see? We saw the gang execute their plan. We saw some bandits distract guards, others used dynamite, they carried off a safe, and they cackled all the way home. And then we actually are going to see the reaction and consequences of this action. Okay, well now the railroad workers can't get any money, and now they're all mad, so they go from town to town, from city to city, to track down the bandits who did it. And when they eventually find them, then we're going to go through the second doorway, which is right before the climax. And Act 3, the conflict reaches its highest point and most tense point, and then it is resolved. And it ends with a feeling of safety. So, imagine the bandit and the railroad worker are about to face off in a duel. And then all of a sudden, the railroad worker just drops his gun and calls the bandit a coward unless they fist fight. And who's going to win? Well, the climax is resolved with the worker winning, and then the bad guys run away, and everyone is safe. That's a Hollywood 3-act. Now, it turns out that the Hollywood 3 Act corresponds to certain literature terms that you'll see on tests and that will help you with reading comprehension. Here's how it looks. We have exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, denouement. That's a French word. Might not be pronouncing that correctly, but just remember it, denouement. Now, normally the climax isn't right in the middle of the story, so kind of think of the climax as being right over here, and then you have falling action and then denouement. This is called the witch's hat or the pyramid shape. But just remember, climax is normally towards the end of the story, not right in the middle. Most of the story is right here in the rising action. That's the longest part. So, what is exposition? Well, we're going to get some background to the story, and we're going to set the scene. Most importantly, in exposition, we learn to care about the characters. We learn to imagine ourselves in these characters' shoes, or at least watching closely what these characters are doing, or perhaps even being affected by these characters in some way. In most short stories and most great novels, there's usually a memorable line or kind of a repeating phrase that kind of comes up here. It might be something like, "So, what's it going to be then, eh?" Or maybe it's Charles Dickens and the story starts off, "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times." How about the opening prologue in Romeo and Juliet? We had this phrase, "two star-crossed lovers." Or maybe it's an ominous short story and it starts off like this, "Her name was Connie." Finally, you're familiar with this one, "The boy who lived, the boy who lived, who's the boy who lived?" Rising action. As I said before, this is usually the longest part of the story. Not necessarily the most important because it's going to have a lot of different scenes and a lot of different stuff happening, but it is the longest part of the story. And it shows a conflict, and it shows how it grows a conflict. And there's always some kind of driving question that's going to keep the readers wanting to pay attention. So maybe if we could think about Harry Potter, first book, we'd have to say, who's after the Sorcerer's Stone? Also, where is it and what does it do? And why is there a three-headed dog? And what about this one? What happens to these poor railroad workers who need money to get food? Maybe we're thinking about, Harry Potter Book 2. Is this serpent going to get out of the Chamber of Secrets and kill all the students? Then we have that climax right at the top of the witch's hat. High point of the story. Has to be very, very emotionally strong. And then this climax is going to alter all the action and progression from the rising action in a very dramatic and important way. So, Harry confronts Quirrell for the Sorcerer's Stone. Or how about Romeo and Juliet? They just got married, and they're trying to run off together, but they kill themselves in the tomb instead. Well, that's a very, very harsh climax. The bandit and the railroad worker get ready to duel. There's another example of a climax. And then we have the falling action and the denouement, which are kind of almost the same thing. In fact, denouement means literally downward motion. So they're almost the same. We see the conflict that's been driving the story finally resolved. So if there's a fight and only one person can win, one person wins. Or if there's a mystery to be solved, then the mystery is solved. Also, we got to see some changes in some lead characters. Normally that's the case. It's called an arc. And at the end, after the climax, there's always a change. And finally, we kind of end with a feeling of safety. At the end of the story, we've seen the lead characters struggle and fight, and we've seen all kinds of trouble. But usually at the end of the denouement, we could imagine them sleeping comfortably in their beds, if it's a happy ending. Now, every Harry Potter book had a pretty predictable downward motion and denouement. There was always that wrap-up with Professor Dumbledore. So it might be something like, "Oh, Quirrell, actually Severus Snape was trying to, protect you. He wasn't trying to kill you." Or maybe it's book 5 where he said something like, "Hey, Harry, could you please stop screaming at me?" And the story for this lesson, the bandits ran away and the workers got their paychecks. How about Romeo and Juliet? What's a denouement in there? I mean, the lead characters died, but there was a great statue erected in their memory, and then suddenly the violence in Verona ceases. Hey, well, that's actually a feeling of safety. Not a feeling of safety for our tragic heroes, but it is a feeling of safety. So, for the assignment, I'd like you to go ahead and look up The Veldt by Ray Bradbury. Now, remember, I don't expect you to actually go to a bookstore and buy this book, but I will suggest to you that you could find this at a library, or you can even probably find this in a Google search. This is a very, very popular story, and it's been famous all over the place. You might even find this in your English textbook you already have for high school. Try to find The Veldt. Now, respond in your notebook to the reading response questions posted at the site. But before you do that, try really hard to discuss this with your friends. These are going to be very, very short answer questions, and there's actually going to be an essay that you're going to write about The Veldt in the next couple of lessons. Now, other thing you need to do is with your pen and paper, draw the book's final scene. There's a very, very interesting final scene at the end of this, and yeah, just about everybody loves to draw it. Don't forget to go through the vocabulary word exercises. They're going to be less than previous lessons, but there's still a couple words that I'd like you to warm up and learn for, test exams and other kinds of things that you're eventually going to have to do. Now, don't watch the next lecture until you've done all this and read The Veldt at least once. I don't want to spoil anything for you. Until then, thanks for using Educator.